This patch is huge, undoing many of the changes made in the most recent imbalance patch and slapping an entirely new patch on top of that. Let's talk about everything changing in this OTA. We're going to start with Shang-Chi. So first things first, two cards did not end up being reverted. They are Enchantress and Negasonic Teenage Warhead. Every other card that was nerfed in the previous patch is seeing a reversion. Yes, that means Killmonger, that means Alioth, that means Cosmo, that means Red Guardian. All of these cards are going back to what they were. But Shang-Chi is staying somewhere in the middle, which is why we're starting with him. This card is going to keep its current text, but go back to 4-3. Which I think is a really interesting and dynamic kind of decision-making process that I wouldn't have expected to come out of this. I have long been a Shang-Chi defender, but what I've learned from the lack of him in the metagame is that thanks to cards like MOMMIES and Mercury and Stardust, a lot of the things that Shang-Chi is supposedly holding back actually have other methods of holding them back. The notable exception here, very specifically, is Sauron, Surtur, Nightmare, the Tens deck, depending on how you build it. That is a deck that is explicitly and specifically vulnerable to what old Shang-Chi's text was. I had someone asking why I was playing Crossbones in my Tens deck recently instead of Typhoid Mary. And the important reason is that it's no longer actually bad to stack two Tens in the same lane. You're very happy to do that, where previously you would be explicitly playing around Shang-Chi by trying to avoid doing that. So I think that is one of the main places where Shang-Chi shows up as oh, this is directly influencing deck building. And so while it can be a good card against move decks, for example, so is Mercury. While it can be the kind of card that if your Hela opponent throws priority can be relevant in that matchup, so can Stardust. And maybe your opponent is playing a Blink Jubilee deck. Stardust answers that too. So I think a lot of the fact that a lot of the idea that Shang-Chi is sort of this underlying pillar of the metagame that has to exist or things are going to get pretty stupid, they put it to the test, and I think they're probably correct to say, maybe we don't actually have this guy around. Maybe the other cards that we have access to are meaningfully able to keep it so Shang-Chi isn't as required to be as good as he has been. And I think this is a pretty reasonable way to approach it. This is, I think, a good change for the health of the game. I might end up posting a meme or two in a few weeks saying, wow, I really miss my Shang-Chi, but I don't know that I will. I've been very impressed with the diversity that the metagame has been able to reach without a Shang-Chi in every single deck, and I think largely me and the people who were convinced that Shang-Chi would be an important card that would be a generator of good outcomes if he were strong, I think we might have been wrong, and maybe it's just actually okay, and all of these other cards can really pick up the slack. It's like that meme of the Ninja Turtles and Master Splinter. Shang-Chi sort of raised all these other tech cards, but now they exist, and they can cover the space that he theoretically covers. So long-term, this is very good news for Surtur decks existing. Short term, I actually don't think it'll be that big of a deal that this card is no longer, or at least for now, going to remain in a relatively nerfed state. Enchantress notably staying the way that she is. I think this is a good change, in large part because it makes her less easily splashable, but makes her more impactful in decks that are able to afford her, and affords more space to cheaper options for dealing with ongoing cards. I think cards like Rogue and even Echo, these are not cards that see a lot of play, in large part because Enchantress is so all-encompassing in the space at 4-6 or even 4-5 that you just rather do Enchantress, get Enchantress in your deck than run one of the slightly iffier options. I think at 5, you start to have a much more meaningful choice as to what you want to do and what specifically you're trying to deal with. I'm not saying this is a direct buff to Rogue and Echo, but it definitely gives them more space to exist in, and I think that's a good thing long term. I think this is one of the easier entire no reverts that they had available to them. The second of the presumably easy no reverts available to them that they chose was Negasonic. Negasonic at 4/5 just makes a ton of sense. I think it's probably bad that people get to free roll this card. As much as I was looking forward to being able to do like, my final turn is Negasonic Gambit in my Danger deck. I was kind of waiting for Negasonic to come back to play Danger, and I guess that she's not coming back is like, all right, I guess I won't be doing that then, but I do think that there is probably a lot to be said for this card probably shouldn't be free rollable at 3. And I think largely one thing that I would point to for why it shouldn't be a 3 and why it makes way more sense as a 4 is Wiccan. I think it's really stupid for Wiccan to be able to do like Iron Patriot, Negasonic, Wiccan. I think that specific curve is just like, that's, you know, it doesn't happen all the time, but it's probably dumb for a very consistent mid-range deck to also have access to this kind of removal ability that pairs well with the 2 drops it wants to play. It's just a little bit like, yeah, okay, if you zoom out, this probably shouldn't cost 3. I get why it costs 4. Selfishly, I'm a little bit sad, but maybe I just get to play a bunch of Zabu cards. Maybe I just do like this and Shang and Danger and Zabu and Misery or something, and that just ends up working out. Colleen Wing going to 2/3 is interesting. It feels a little bit like really what they don't want to do is make a change to the cards that really matter to discard. And they mentioned this in the notes that it's sort of hard to make a meaningful change to those cards that doesn't kind of obliterate the deck. And so I get why they would aim their decision-making process at something like a Colleen Wing instead. And it's not like it'll never, ever, ever matter. But I do think that discard is going to be basically 100% fine without having to run Colleen Wing. It'll be chill. Colleen Wing is like really the best discard enablers have always been Blade MODOK, at least since Blade got changed. Those have always been what you want to do in your discard deck anyway. Now you have Bullseye. Do you even really need Colleen Wing? Or is she just sort of hanging around like a vestigial inclusion in much the same way as several of the other cards are? I think that this is a reasonable thought process, like to say, we don't really want to do like 3/3 Dakin, that would probably kill him. We don't want to do meaningful stuff to like Khonshu or Apocalypse or like the carries and the cool cards. So we're going to take some points off of the enabler. It's just, I don't think you're going to get a lot out of doing this. I would guess that where you're going to get more out of this is like maybe if they hit a MODOK or something, because at least that card is in all of these decks. But maybe they didn't feel like it was that far out of line. I personally don't feel like discard is out of line. I don't think they needed to do this. I think there are plenty of other things. Like, I don't know why you'd be aiming a nerf at discard and not like Human Torch, for example, other than it's probably a lot easier to come up with a reasonable small downward nudge for the discard deck than it is to come up with a reasonable small downward nudge for Human Torch because of the way he compounds his own stats. I do think that this is a deck I wouldn't be nerfing, but I'm also not really of the mind that this is going to be a big deal to it. Agatha Harkness is losing 2 points of power, and I honestly think they weren't harsh enough on this card. Like, if it were me, I would have just deleted her. But again, they have preempted me. I would have just been like, this card doesn't start in your hand anymore. They were like, well, if we do that, she just won't see any play. And to me, my answer is good. I think it's good. I think that is a good thing. I don't want her to, like, no one does anything reasonable with this card. 100% of people playing this card are discarding it to redshift and then using it to either play a Ghost Rider, play a Hela, or get an Ebony Blade. That's the only thing people do with this card. That's it. There's nothing else. This card will never do anything other than that. That is the only thing that it will ever do. And I don't really feel like that's a use case worth protecting, but they evidently do. And they have protected it in the sense that they've made it a little bit worse. Now, instead of getting something bigger than a Hulk, you just get a Hulk. That does actually matter, as much as I hate to say it. Like, I'm not going to say like, oh my God, they cooked, but her stats really do matter in this context, because you are playing something that is like objectively bad if you aren't discarding it. You are going to lose the game if you don't get your discarders. And while it is likely that you get your discarders, the fact that there are just games where you just instantly lose, it does matter. And so I do think that the thing that sticks out here largely is I think that there is an inflection point on Agatha's power that does make her weak enough that you aren't interested in doing the things that she's asking of you. However, I don't think that we've reached it. If you interpret her as an upside, she is still, vanilla stats with upside that's reasonable enough to play, and she's still the deck thinning aspect of her is unfortunately still the relevant thing that you're doing with her. So I would say I would expect probably less attempts at doing Agatha things that are, Red Shift and Black Knight related, and more just like, yeah, I run her in Hela, so then I draw my Hela more, like that kind of stuff seems like it's going to be a little more the speed, less of these mid-rangey Ghost Rider Juggernaut type things, more of just this is a Hela card. Stardust getting nerfed, not on my bingo card. I don't view this as particularly necessary, but I do think it is sort of twinned with the Agatha nerf because a lot of the stuff that Stardust stops is like Agatha-related stuff. But the reason I don't think this is particularly necessary is I was already kind of cutting this card. Like, if this was 2 weeks ago, you could have been like, yo, Stardust, busted. Best card in the game, that's awesome. But in the intervening 2 weeks, Stardust has, to me, sort of clearly come out as like the worst of the 3 remaining tech cards, Mobius, Mercury, and her, of course. And while I do think that a lot of that is that, move is really good, that makes a ton of sense. It's very good to, like, Stardust does nothing against move, and move is pushing on a lot of the decks that would normally be Stardust decks, because it's like, okay, nice Hela, my Human Torch is 10 billion power, I guess I don't really even care about you. And so there's just been less things that Stardust hits. I think this is a mild overreaction. I would not have done it. I would have kept her at 4-7. I think that I'm already cutting her from decks. Like, I know Browday was like, what do I do to get Mercury in my deck? And it was like, cut Stardust, dude. We were having that conversation just earlier today before I recorded this video. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say that this is an overreaction, and to me, I think that it is. But I also think that if you're gonna like commensurately nerf the Hela stuff, you might as well nerf this. I just wouldn't do it. I think that the things she keeps in check are so deleterious to a metagame that nerfing her is just something I would never really approach. People are very, I am very vocal about how I feel about Hela stuff and just generally decks that make it impossible to play mid-rangey strategies by virtue of always instantly beating them. I do not believe that those things in high play rates are part of a healthy metagame because of the way they take a lot of the nuance away from Marvel Snap, i.e. there are 3 locations. I choose where I'm going to put my points. This point allocation actually matters, and say, actually, none of this points allocation matters. Hello, here are all of my numbers. I think this is an overreaction because those metagames tend to get pushed very far into just numbers territory when Hela is a good enough deck. Stardust being nerfed, I don't know how much it's going to actually impact its power, but it's going to impact her ability to be in decks, I think, pretty strongly, and that means that people are probably going to play Hela, and all we can do is just sort of hope that the Hela spiral doesn't start. This is not what I would have done. Lockjaw going to 2-3 is another card that I sort of view as tied with the Stardust thing. Like, Stardust being in a bunch of decks makes Lockjaw a little bit harder to use, I think, for obvious reasons. And this card being what it is, like, when you play a Lockjaw deck, there's a lot of, like, Lockjaw, Blink, Jubilee. You sort of lean into doing stuff like this, which leans you even further into getting hosed by Stardust. So not only is Lockjaw getting better, the thing that beats it is getting worse. I would be excited to see this if I weren't already, like, meaningfully worried about the Hela stuff. I don't think this is going to, like, break it or anything, but there are certainly metagames that we go into where there are decks that are large enough that board building doesn't really matter against them. And I don't know that Lockjaw has ever been one of those outside of Thanos, but there is the outside chance that it becomes one of those kind of decks. And I do have those worries. I really do. This is just one of many reasons I wouldn't have nerfed Stardust, but I guess they are taking a look at lowering the guardrails a little bit. I think that the guardrails are about as low as they can be right now, but I understand why when they're reverting a bunch of other tech cards, they're like, what if we tried and made this kind of thing pretty good in this metagame? I mean, spoiler alert for future content on the channel, I just did a Rate the Cards episode with a game designer who has worked for like 20 years in the card game design space. And one of the things he talked about was that OTAs or patches in live service Stardust games can be about creating different textures of metagames rather than being about specifically getting everything about every balance decision correct. They're about, what if this kind of playstyle is good? What if this kind of playstyle is good? And I think that is a through line I'm seeing in this OTA specifically. Awesome Andy gaining 1 power up to 2. I guess they're worried about this guy being too good with Jocasta. I don't know, man. Like, I'm not seeing it with Awesome Andy. I didn't see it at 2-1. I don't see it with 2-2. I don't think I'm gonna see it at 2-3, but he is part of the 4-part Herbie quadumvirate that we've got going on. A bunch of cards that are just Herbie's activates on other cards. This is one of them. It's not very good. I get that they gave it 1 power. They probably should have given it 2, but I know they were probably just like, oh, well, are we sure we should give it 2 power? Jocasta's coming out. And it's like, in theory, that sounds right. But also I would say, yes, I am sure you should have given it 2 power. I don't know when I'm going to play this guy. I'm sorry. Mystique going to 1 cost, referred to as a slight nerf, or 1 power, sorry, referred to as a slight nerf to Mr. Negative in the patch notes is so funny. Because for the longest time, the meme in the community was like, every time something lost power, it was like, oh, they buffed it in Mr. Negative. And now something's gaining power, and they're like, oh, it's because we want to nerf it in Mr. Negative. I don't know. I don't really get where they're going for here. I think the largest place you'll see Mystique is in, yes, Mr. Negative, Cerebro, Gordex, that kind of stuff. This 1 power is totally meaningless basically 100% of the time. I just don't know. I don't know what's going on here. I really don't get it. Because I think it's like, okay, so if we put it to 2, then we're really buffing Cerebro 2. If we put it to 3, we're really buffing Cerebro 3. And this probably can't be a 3-4. So I guess we'll just give it 1 power. Like, I'm gonna throw my hands up on this one. I don't really get where they're coming from. And yes, I've read what they wrote in the notes. Viv Vision going to 3-3. I think this is a pretty solid change. I was iffy on her at 3-2. At 3-3, I think she's suddenly just a lot more worth considering in a lot more different places. And I wouldn't be shocked to see a decent amount of like this card getting a pretty fair amount better. And the reason for that is that the difference between 2 and 3 is unfortunately pretty massive for this card, because the more you're able to play her on empty locations, the more her individual power matters a ton. And if you're able to play her on an empty location and get 3 power there baseline, it's going to be pretty difficult for your opponent to contest that location and prevent it from getting larger and larger and larger. What I'm interested in especially is, does this make her more vulnerable or less vulnerable to like building around her? Is this just a card that, say, you're going to want to play in your Wiccan deck as a good 3? Or is it going to be something that you really want a lot of specific things that go with her in order to make her make sense? I'm not sure, but I think she takes a big step towards being better. We'll find out if it's a big enough step, but she's definitely a much more reasonable card at 3. Last up is Destroyer. If you'll pardon the incredibly hacked together Photoshop job on the right here, or the left, I'm not actually sure what side things are when I record this because everything is reversed for me. This is an 18 power card now, and the power changes to Destroyer will not stop until morale improves. I think many people who actually enjoyed this card preferred it when it was blowing up its own lane too, so you would get like extra Nimrod triggers. But I have run into people who are doing like armor Professor X stuff with this card, and the 18 power will matter to them. I'm not saying you can just play Spectrum Destroyer again like it's good old 2023. You probably can't do that, but I do think that this is a card that gets meaningfully more relevant the larger it is, and the more ways there are to alleviate its downside. I am interested to see if some kind of Prof X Luna Snow Destroyer type deck does work. I'm not positive it will, or that would be meaningfully better than just doing, Mercury Cannonball instead. I don't know. I'm interested in finding out. This is a change I am fully in support of. There is one card being reverted that I want to highlight specifically, and that card is Killmonger. Of all the cards that are going to be changed in this patch, I think Killmonger is the one that I consider the most likely to have a major impact on the metagame. When you look at the decks that I think have been really good recently, many of them are counting on 1-drops to be a decent sized portion of their power. In addition, the reversion to Shadow King should be meaningful in terms of pushing against move decks. So really, what I'm trying to talk about here is Killmonger SK. I think those two cards are likely to resume a fairly metagame defining role. Not necessarily that they're going to be in the best deck, but that they're going to define what you are and are not allowed to do. And the reason I don't like nerfing Stardust in the same patch as you bring those back is I think those cards have a naturally depressing impact on the amount of points in your average game. And so I think Stardust is already going to be on the way out because people are going to be less able to subsidize it with these cheap cards that gain stats or with these 1-drops. I mean, look at poor Sunspot. Poor Sunspot is getting absolutely housed by both of those cards. It's just not going to be a good spot for anyone who bought Warlock, which I talked about in my Warlock video about how afraid I was of that deck getting really hurt by reversions to Killmonger and Shadow King. And I think that is very, very likely what is going to happen. And once those cards start depressing the overall point output of the game, decks like Hela, decks that are able to like go over the top of things, that Stardust is no longer going to be in those decks because it's not being able to be subsidized in the same way. Basically, I think they jumped the gun on this Stardust thing because they are bringing back these two cards. That's very specifically why. If their numbers say Stardust is really good, that's probably down to the fact that Stardust is good because the things it beats are good. I would not have done that Stardust nerf, and that's really the big thing for me. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. I've been KMBest. You've been phenomenal, and I'll see you in the next one.